So I want to start to begin to just have a little bit of thought about this second domain. Usually when you see the Brahmaviharas listed, you see them in this order of metta, compassion, joyfulness, and equanimity. As I've thought about this a lot, and actually I find it more helpful to change that order when I teach this territory, and to do metta and then joyfulness. Mudita. Mudita, appreciative joyfulness. This is not necessarily about blissful moments of celebration. It's not particularly about emotional rushes of joyfulness. Sometimes mudita is about just a quiet gladness and a quiet appreciation. And you cannot make yourself joyful, but you can learn to make room for joyfulness. You can learn to make space for joyfulness. Mindfulness helps a lot with this. You know, in those moments when, you know, life can feel so bleak or you find yourself so despairing, you know, what is it like to step outside and to see the change, the beginning of the changing colors in the leaves, the squirrel, you know, running in the branches, the laugh of a child, the space around the trees. I think we all need to make appointments with appreciation and with joyfulness. It will not necessarily just come to us on a platter. That capacity for appreciation is something that we cultivate in our life. What is well? You know, there's so many reasons why people struggle with joyfulness. You know, some people feel that given the amount of suffering in the world that it's really kind of frivolous to cultivate joyfulness. Some people come from religious backgrounds, you know, where suffering is seen as being more worthy than joyfulness. We might have our own ideologies that we're not worthy of joyfulness. We might have inner philosophies that think that joyfulness is going to come to us after I've worked out everything that's wrong and difficult, that somehow joyfulness is going to be a kind of reward for that. I don't think this is how joyfulness is really spoken about in the teaching. You know, it's not about being worthy. It's certainly not about being frivolous, but it is about what resources compassion, and it is about what gives a sense of aliveness and meaningfulness to our moments, to learn how to appreciate, to touch upon what gladdens our hearts, what gladdens our minds. And it doesn't have to be difficult. I remember years and years ago teaching with a friend and a colleague, and I arrived in the morning. I was in a grumpy mood, you know, there was no doubt about it. I was in a grumpy mood. I got caught in a traffic jam. I was late, you know. It was just one of those days. And he very quickly perceived my grumpiness. And he said, well, you know, did you have enough to eat this morning? I said, yes. Did your car get you here safely? Didn't break down? You're right, you know. Your children doing okay? Yep. You know, and he began to go through this long list of what was well in my life. And I could feel this mood just beginning to lift, you know, and really appreciating, you know, it's psychologically, I think it's well recognized that we have a deeply embedded negative attentional bias. You know, we tend to focus on, our attention is easily drawn to what is wrong, what is broken, what is imperfect. That negative attentional bias, you know, combined with many other factors, is a recipe for leaching joyfulness from our lives. For leaching joyfulness from our lives. And when I think about what mindfulness does, it begins to rebalance that negative attentional bias. And that is what this cultivation of joyfulness is also concerned with. It's not pretending. You know, it's not trying to pretend that everything is perfect or terrific. It's not getting into that kind of, you know, positivism, you know, that, you know, everything's really okay, you know, and, you know, people are wonderful. No, it's not getting into that sort of kind of thinking. But we actually do have much to appreciate on a daily level. You know, I can appreciate at the moment, you know, that I'm quite healthy at the moment. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that wonderful, you know? It's not just terrific, you know? I actually have lovely people in my life, you know? That's so amazing. That's so fortunate, you know? There are so many things that we can begin to appreciate. And again, it's not a rejection of difficult moods. It's not a rejection of, you know, some of the reactions that we have. But it's what resources us. You know, in the beginning of the pandemic, I was teaching with some people who were working on the COVID wards. And, you know, they were under-resourced on every level. You know, on every level, under-resourced, and just faced with so much suffering of seeing people dying. You know, so many people dying and not being able to save them. You know, and not being able to feel that it was a tsunami in the early stages. It was just a tsunami of suffering. And, you know, I had nurses saying to me, I can't afford to feel anymore. You know, that it's too much. I can't afford to feel anymore. I need to sort of harden myself. I need to numb myself. When I was teaching with people that in those times, I didn't say to people, I think you should sit more. I think you should practice more. I said to them, I think you should find what gladdens your heart. I think you should find and cultivate what it is that brings some sense of gladness, even a taste of joyfulness. And it's often said, you know, that joyfulness and compassion go so closely hand in hand because it's joyfulness that resources our ability to sustain compassion. Otherwise, compassion without joyfulness, we're easily overwhelmed by the intensity and immensity of suffering. We need joyfulness, especially in the most difficult times of our lives. The times, yes, when we are faced with family breakdowns or illness or, you know, our world's crumbling, you know, and all the things that can go wrong. These are the moments when we most need this cultivation. Not in the times of our lives that are the easiest and the smoothest and, you know, the most perfect, but actually in those most challenging times. What is it that I can appreciate? Sometimes it's so small, those moments, but actually so crucial. Joyfulness has another element to it, I think, as an insight practice. It so addresses this sense of insufficiency, that I don't have enough, you know, I'm not good enough. I don't have what I need. There's a sense of deficit culture, a sense of lack inwardly, you know. And when you look at that sense of insufficiency or a deficit culture, this is actually what craving is rooted in. You know, and as an insight practice, joyfulness is very much about concerned with meeting that craving impulse to reach outside of ourselves to find the happiness that we feel unable to find within. That's what craving is about. I will reach outside of myself for experience, for objects, for so many things that I feel I need, I want, I must have in order to be happy, in order to somehow satisfy that sense of a vacuum within. It is a powerful impulse in our world, craving. You know, it turns us into basically consumers of the world, doesn't it? So much is sacrificed. You know, so many of our deepest values of care and respect are sacrificed in the force of that wave of craving. You know? And in the Buddhist tradition, of course, this word tanha. that's translated as craving. You know, the appetite that can never find satisfaction. The wanting that has no answer. You know, the kind of endlessness of that. And indeed, we do see the suffering of it, don't we? The Buddha said the world is on fire with craving. 2,600 years ago, he said that. It's actually more literal today, isn't it? That the world is on fire with craving. It is more literal. When the Buddha speaks about joyfulness, he speaks about, it's kind of strange words. I mean, the literal translations are fleshly and non-fleshly joyfulness. Kind of strange. It's the most accurate translation, but it sometimes speaks about as sensual and non-sensual joyfulness. There is actually, you know, it's recognized in the early teachings that there's so much that is lovely in this world, isn't there? Good friends, you know, nature, art, music, poetry, literature. There is so much that is lovely that can be appreciated without becoming the kind of root of craving, of needing more, wanting more, of not enough. So much that can be appreciated. And I think it's really important to appreciate all of this because, again, it just gives us that taste of what gladness is, what joyfulness is. He also speaks about non-sensual joyfulness. And actually, every wholesome quality has a taste of non-sensual joyfulness. Think about the taste of generosity, you know, the taste of kindness, you know, the taste of patience, you know, the taste of caring. All of this has a taste of non-sensual joyfulness in the sense that it's not born of an object. It is inwardly born. And when the Buddha speaks about this path, you know, much of it is concerned with cultivating this non-sensual joyfulness, cultivating the lovely, cultivating the wholesome, the joyfulness of a well-collected heart and mind. The joyfulness of stillness, you know, the joyfulness of groundedness, the joyfulness of being embodied. You think of the teachings of the whole of this path are really about cultivating the lovely and appreciating that inwardly generated joyfulness that can be present in the most adverse conditions. It can be present in the most adverse conditions. That's actually quite a high aspiration. You know, we actually see when we're in the midst of the difficult and aversion begins to operate or fear begins to operate, you know, how the mind, how the heart contracts, doesn't it? Contracts around that difficulty, contracts around that affliction. You know, this is the nature of identification, is that contraction. And in that contractedness, the possibilities of joyfulness feel very elusive. And a lot of the practice that we do and a lot of the cultivation we do is about easing that contractedness quite intentionally. You know, that I recognize that I'm obsessing, I'm ruminating, I'm identifying, and rather than feeling, well, I'm going to work on this, I'm going to hammer away from this, maybe this is time for an out-breath. This is maybe time to hear the birds sing. Maybe this is a time to appreciate what is well. Joyfulness has many, many elements, and gratitude, appreciation and gratitude are very powerful elements within joyfulness. To learn that gratefulness for what is well, for what is enough. And beginning perhaps as we develop in this path, you know, more and more I feel the sense of healing, that sense of insufficiency inwardly. Healing that sense of deficit, you know, learning to befriend this mind, body, heart as it is, and feeling there is actually enough in this moment for care, for appreciation, for patience, for kindness. Again, in the early days of lockdown, when my young grandson was living with me, he was almost 5 at the time. And, you remember those times when we weren't allowed to go anywhere and, we were all staying close to home. So, we were good in our family. We followed all the guidelines, so we would go out on our daily trip up to the local field for our hour with my 5-year-old. And we would do pretty much the same thing every day, for months, And one day we were going up the field and he said to me, we do the same thing every day, don't we? And I said, yes. And I began to apologize. I'm so sorry, and the time will come where we can have more adventures. He said, but Amma, he calls me Amma. He says, Amma, I'm not complaining. He says, I have everything I need. And I thought, oh, so powerful. I have everything I need. And on some level, it was so true. People who cared for him, safety, he had everything he needed. And I found that just such a powerful statement, that I have everything I need for well-being, for happiness just now. The Buddha says, live in joyfulness, in friendliness, even amongst those who hate. Live in joyfulness, in health, even amongst the afflicted. Live in joyfulness, in peace, even amongst the troubled. Look within, be still, free from fear and clinging. Know the sweet joy of the way. When you see joyfulness mentioned in the context of the Brahmaviharas, how it's often referred to, this word mudita, is appreciative joyfulness. As a way of countering these very powerful impulses of craving, rooted in insufficiency. It's also spoken very much as about an altruistic, a selfless joy, our capacity to celebrate the happiness and well-being of others. It's a quality of altruistic joy that's said that so much leads to the falling away of envy and covetousness and resentment. It's trying times when our friend's child does better than our own in exams. And yet we learn to celebrate their achievement. It's trying times when someone gets a job that we coveted, but we celebrate their happiness. Our neighbor goes on a wonderful holiday while it rains throughout ours, and we celebrate their happiness. These are very trivial examples. I want to read you something, this appreciative joy, to see the goodness and celebrate the happiness of others. In Sri Lanka, when the monks and the nuns go on their morning begging rounds in the villages, where people offer them their food for the day, they respond by offering a blessing. And the blessing, one of the traditional blessings that they offer says, "How wonderful you are in your being. I delight that you're here. I take joy in your good fortune, and may your happiness continue." I have to confess, when I first heard this blessing, I had a small cringe moment. I thought, no, this is just a bit too sweet, a bit too saccharine, and I'm not quite sure how you would say that wholeheartedly and heartfully, And then I thought about it. The sense of being able to offer that kind of appreciation, we do encounter in our lives, actually. I know when my first grandchild was born, he could do no wrong in my eyes. He could pee in my face and I would be celebrating how wonderful he was in his being, And, there was something just so unhesitating about that celebration. And then, of course, we grow older, and now he's often, an 8-year-old, often grumpy. And I don't think I would celebrate his peeing in my face any longer. But there's still something there that I so celebrate, his goodness. I so appreciate his goodness. But doesn't it get more complex as we age? And our relationships become more complex. And, we see what is, of course, especially with people close to us, what is wrong with them, what is imperfect, what they could improve. And our capacity to celebrate that gets quite muted. I think part of this altruistic joy is really about melting the gap between self and other. It's really about melting the gap between self and other. Just as we would wish to be appreciated, so too can we appreciate another. And it often begins also with our capacity to appreciate ourselves. Because this is where the voice of the inner critic and the judgmental voice often goes into overdrive, where we are much better at highlighting what is wrong with us. And I often think about what it would be like to take that blessing into our own lives and our own relationship with ourselves. What it would be like to get up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, how wonderful I am in my being. I delight that I'm here. May my happiness deepen and my good fortune continue. Would it be challenging? Yeah? Would it be challenging? No, you look in the mirror and say, another wrinkle, another gray hair, another day in front of me, I'm not going to be good enough, And yet this sense of appreciation inwardly is actually quite critical. In Buddhist traditions, I think in Buddhist circles, where, a good Buddhist seemingly is incredibly modest, They don't appreciate themselves, that's considered to be pride or, something not quite so wholesome. But actually there is a part of this movement into a sense of sufficiency is also appreciation. I feel like when I teach retreats, at the end of every sitting, no matter how it was, people should just sort of pat themselves on the back and say, well done. Well done, just for showing up. Just for showing up. The agitated, the aversive mind is always creating the other. And you notice in the midst of all unwholesome qualities, the voice of selfing and the voice of othering, the volume of that gets turned right up. And you notice in the presence of all the wholesome qualities, that voice of selfing and the voice of othering really begins to calm down and quiet. And we see ourselves in the eyes of another. Mudita, this appreciative joy, I think speaks to one of the core, what are called the core obstructions in the Buddhist teaching. When he speaks about mana, that's often translated as being the conceit of self, but it's actually about relational positioning. How I see myself in relationship to you. And how this is often an unconscious patterning that is happening throughout our day in our encounters with others, that I see myself as being better than you, superior to you, or I see myself as being worse than you, inferior to you, or I see us all as operating in the same equality of confusion, that we're all the same. Everybody does this. Now this is one of the core distortions that the Buddha speaks about, and it's a distortion that leaches most of the Brahmaviharas from our lives. Kindness, appreciative joyfulness, compassion, equanimity. And it is often so unconscious, and yet influences so much in our lives. You know, whether I feel worthy enough to ask a question or not, whether I feel I need to sit in the back of the room and be invisible, or whether I need to sit in the front of the room and be very visible. It influences and shapes what we believe is to be possible for us and what is impossible for us, our aspirations or our sense of confinement and curtailment. And this mana is not just inwardly generated, by the way. This is often a story that is told to us by our families, by our cultures, by our societies, and you see how it is threaded through so much of the division that we experience in life. Appreciative joyfulness, this cultivation of the wholesome, is meant to really begin to dispel that relational positioning, that relational comparing. It's not about becoming the same as, but it is a capacity to appreciate and to celebrate. When we practice with the Brahmaviharas, it's not always hierarchical. I mean, I would say, I would suggest that metta is the foundation of all of the other Brahmaviharas beginning to develop, because we need to be able to stand near to things. We cannot celebrate from a distance. We cannot find compassion from a distance. We cannot find equanimity from a distance. So we need to be able to stand near to things, which is what metta is really about. But actually, as we practice these Brahmaviharas, I think of them almost like a musical scale. You know, we listen inwardly and we see, you know, what kind of patterns are emerging. Is it aversion? Is it envy? You know, is it anxiety? And we begin, or is it despair? And we begin to sense what is appropriate right now. What is it helpful to cultivate right now in the midst of this?